Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something a little tricky and maybe a little smelly. The medieval in this was the stopover for exhausted travelers, where stew was suspicious, ale was abundant, and lice were inevitable. Half the night you weren't sure if the noise upstairs was snoring, fighting, or someone expiring quietly. So before we settle in, hit the like button and subscribe if you actually enjoy this kind of thing, okay? And drop a comment with where you're rewatching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing the mix of places and time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slip into tonight's tale together. It's not that the innkeeper wakes up, Cass, that he is woken by the wet sound of someone sneezing onto the floorboards beneath his room, followed by a thud, a groan, okay, and the frantic flapping of a chicken bolting through the front door. Again, he opens one eye. It's still dark, which means it's either ridiculously early or hopelessly late. In medieval timekeeping, those are the only two options. He rises slowly, peeling himself off his straw mattress like dough off a sticky board. He wipes his face on a sleeve that used to be linen, but now feels more like an old saddle. Yeah, his bed isn't terrible, just simple. Straw stuffing, a slanted frame, and a blanket that smells faintly of garlic and stale beer. It's cozy enough if your standards are flexible. He dresses in pieces. Tunic first, then trousers, then the belt if he can find it. After a short search, he discovers it hanging on a peg with a spoon, a candle stub, and a lone sock. Best not to ask questions before dawn. Downstairs, the common room is strangely still. A tipped mug here, a lone boot by the hearth, a man snoring under a table like he's claimed it by right. The innkeeper tiptoes past. Waking the guests too early often results in uncomfortable conversations at sword point. He stirs the embers into life. The trick is, gentle heat firewood costs money. And the last time he built a blaze, someone tried to roast a goose on it, feathers intact. He sets a pot over the flames, warming whatever last night's stew has evolved into. Outside, he hears the bray of a mule and the shuffle of travelers arriving. He exhales. This place isn't luxurious, but it's warm, it's busy, and above all it's his. It's breakfast, though, is less of a feast and more of a gamble between edible and probably fine. The innkeeper spoons a thick ladle of pottage into the pot. Not a dish so much as a way of life. Yesterday's pottage was barley and turnip. Today's is those same turnips, softer now, plus some questionable scraps from last night's unlucky goose. Add water, reheat, repeat. It's like soup if soup got tired halfway through. The bread is present, though bread might be generous. It's as hard as roof tiles and twice as durable. Guests chew it carefully, both to avoid breaking teeth and to reconsider their life decisions between bites. And, of course, the ale. Morning beer wasn't an exaggeration, it was survival. Water couldn't be trusted. Milk belonged to the Lord's animals, and tea was still centuries away. Weak ale, at least, was boiled and safer than most alternatives. Even the kids drank it, though with supervision. After all, this is a respectable end. By now, patrons shuffle in, a merchant clutching his purse like it's holy, his pilgrim mumbling about blisters, and inevitably the bard who asks for honey, like it hasn't been locked away for months. The barmaid glides between them all, dodging drunks, topping mugs, and batting away clumsy flirtations with the ease of someone who's heard every bad verse a tipsy poet could invent. By the end of breakfast, the air smells of smoke, barley, and vague determination. Bowls clatter, empty. Spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, it's filling, and nobody's dead. Which, for the Middle Ages, is a solid win. By mid-morning, more guests stream in like pigeons with luggage and the same attitude toward cleanliness. First is a knight, or at least a man wearing rusty, mismatched armor tied together with rope. He demands a private room, despite lacking coin, courtesy, or soap. Behind him trails a merchant's apprentice who haggles over stew, as if this were a marketplace. Then the bardigan, launching into a tragic ballad about lost goats no one asked for. A monk follows, blessing the furniture before declaring he's fasting until he decides half a loaf docently count as sin. Soon the room fills with clashing smells and louder voices. Socks hang near the fire, knives are sharpened for no good reason, and a goose resumes its vendetta against a child. And through it all, the innkeeper stays calm, wiping down the counter with a rag older than some kingdoms. By nightfall, someone will fall asleep in their stew, someone will fall in love, and someone will challenge a chair to single combat. Probably the bard again. The inn has a real brain gnawer of beating heart tits. Barmaid. Marjorie. She's somewhere between 20 and 30, or possibly older thanks to years of dealing with traveling poets. She is the backbone of the place. Without her, the inn would collapse in on itself like a soggy loaf. She weaves through chaos like it's choreographed. One hand balancing mugs, the other ready to slap away an overconfident mercenary. She speaks in 4 dialects, pours ale without spilling, and delivers insults so sharp they're technically legal. A drunken soldier once admired her ankles and later woke to find his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can spot a liar, sniff out a stolen trinket, can't tell exactly who will pay in coin and who will try to bargain with seashells. She serves stew, tends scrapes, wrangles children, and somehow keeps mugs filled while dodging thrown cutlery. The miracle. She never drops a tray. On parchment, the inn belongs to the innkeeper. In practice, it's her kingdom.
The innkeeper may own the building, but Marjorie commands the floorboards. A wink here, a sharp retort there, and a stare strong enough to curdle cream. It's a constant performance, and she plays it daily with the poise that comes from low expectations and a saintly level of endurance. Midday at a medieval inn isn't exactly a meal-it, as more like a trial run for patience, balance, and tolerance of a noise level hovering somewhere between fairground and battlefield. It starts innocently. The fire is warm, the stew bubbles gently, and Marjorie clangs the dented iron triangle that signals it's time to eat. For a fleeting second, it's calm, then chaos explodes. Guests appear from hidden corners. A trader vaults over a dozing hound. Stare shared by battlefield medics and women who've broken up too many seating arguments before noon. A pair of guards compete in a burping contest near the hearth while suspiciously. Cheerful monk sings between bites. The goat returns as well, apparently a regular customer now. Lunch lasts roughly an hour, according to the sun outside. Inside, time is measured by how long it takes before someone spills ale on themselves, accuses their neighbor of cheating at dice. Nobody admits to owning it. It's tossed onto the possibly someone's pile behind the bar. Marjorie gathers dishes with the speed of a woman who has done this for years and would rather not. Stragglers who linger too long get the look. One glare once made a noble apologize and drop an entire silver coin before disappearing forever. The tale is still told. The stew pot is scraped bare. What's left goes either to the pigs or quietly reappears in tomorrow's menu. Waste not, want not, and after 3 servings no one can tell anyway. The innkeeper mumbles about washing mugs, though everyone knows he'll just dunk them in the rain barrel and call it holy water. There's a soaking bucket, but it's mostly symbolic. Once the crumbs are brushed away and benches, returned always wobblier than before, the room again resembles an inn rather than the aftermath of a well-fed rebellion. Marjorie straightens her apron, sighs, and braces herself. Peace never lasts here. It's just the gap between one disaster and the next. Somewhere, someone is already wondering when supper will be ready. She finally dares a sip of leftover ale. A quiet moment. Then the door creaks open. Fresh travelers. Fresh chaos. And worst of all questions. The first man wears a cloak too large, a beard fit for nesting birds, and the expression of someone about to write a scathing parchment review. He asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" The silence that follows is profound. A stool groans under the weight of collective judgment. Behind him, a young couple enters. They're clearly unmarried. Based on how close they stand, while pretending not to touch, they request to see the room first. Marjorie gestures upstairs. It has wood. It has walls. It doesn't leak in summer. What more could they possibly want?
The third guest usually drifts in covered in dust and inflated with self-importance, demanding to know where the inn buys its candles, whether the stew is ethically sourced, and if the goat has been trained to remain outdoors. Naturally, the goat strolls in at that exact moment and sneezes directly on his boots. Then comes the bard, another bard. Not the earlier one who offers to settle his bill with a song. He plucks his lute, strikes 3 sour notes in a row, and launches into a tragic ballad about the maiden with the leaky chamber pot. His performance ends when he's gently, but firmly persuaded to stop with the help of a broom. The innkeeper greets every demand, complaint, and mangled question about wine with the same patient nod. There is only one wine, and it's reddish. He doesn't argue, doesn't explain. He just smiles and lets Marjorie handle things, 'cause nothing fills an inn faster than travelers with strong opinions, and they never arrive quietly. By sunset, the common room is a quilt of personalities, a silent scribe tucked into a corner, merchants bickering by the fire, the bard still trying to win affection by sheer volume, and the goat now curled up under table 3. The innkeeper exhales. Another group, another round of disasters waiting to happen, and every last one of them somehow believes they're the normal one. Supper arrives not with ceremony, but with clamor. Chairs scrape, mugs clash, and someone coughs theatrically to hint they've been waiting an eternity, despite only arriving 9 minutes earlier and still wearing their travel cloak like it's a royal robe. Marjorie emerges from the kitchen carrying a pot that's technically hot and definitely still stew. The menu hasn't changed, never changes. It's the inn's specialty, whatever's left from earlier, warmed over again, served with bread sturdy enough to serve as a blunt weapon, plus commentary from the diners. This stew tastes different than last night. One guest observes suspiciously. It's the same stew, Marjorie replies without glancing up. Oh, well, it's delicious. They quickly add, suddenly worried about their cutlery privileges. The bard still here offers another song in honor of the meal. He manages one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl with a touch more force than necessary. He understands. At the hearth, 2 merchants shout about grain prices, louder somehow than the couple tallying the number of fleas in their upstairs bed. The goat has returned once again, this time fed bits of bread by a child who insists it as his comfort animal. The stew is filling. The ale flows, which helps with how filling the stew is. And despite occasional complaints about flavor, texture, or the uncertain identity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been properly cleaned in months, watching with the weary expression of a man resigned to his fate. He knows what's coming. Within the hour, something will spill. Someone will nod off mid-sentence, and the bard will try again. He always does. But for now, the room is alive, loud, messy, and that alone counts as success. In a medieval inn, supper doesn't need to impress. It just needs to arrive without igniting. When the last spoon scrapes the bottom of the last bowl and the groans of overfed travelers echo through the room, the true spectacle begins. Evening entertainment, such as it is. There's no schedule, no flyers, no master of ceremonies. It simply unfolds, improvised, under-rehearsed, and with a high likelihood of mild injury. The bard, naturally, seizes the stage. He clears his throat with theatrical weight, strums 3 hesitant strings, and declares his next ballad, The Fair Lady of Festerwell, Who Married a Troll. Half the crowd cheers, the other half groans. The goat sneezes. His voice is enthusiastic, the rhymes accidental. The innkeeper pours himself a mug and drinks like a man bracing for 6 verses, at least one of which will involve sock theft. At the far table, 2 old friends challenge each other in a slurred riddle contest. The rules are vague, and one of the riddles might actually be a cooking recipe. A nearby monk covers his ears politely and begins humming psalms at church bell volume. Caius hit the table, necks wooden, chipped, possibly enchanted. Opinions differ. A crowd gathers as bets are placed with coins, buttons, a ragged pair of trousers, and one traveler's left shoe. The shoe's value is debated. Marjorie circles the room like a hawk tuned to chaos. She watches for trouble, spills, and anyone foolish enough to climb on furniture. She intercepts the bard mid-gesture as he attempts to balance dramatically on a wobbly bench leg. In the corner, a shy traveler produces a flute. He gets 3 sweet notes out before the goat headbutts him. Applause erupts. Evening entertainment at the inn is never polished, rarely rehearsed, and probably illegal in certain towns. But it's genuine. It's loud. It nearly always ends with someone face down in their mug or waking up with a suit-drawn tattoo. There's no official closing time here. There's no bell, no closing call, and definitely no courteous usher hinting that it's time to head out. Instead, closing is more of a slow unraveling of civilization. It begins the moment the bard finally exhausts his listeners. Usually, this happens when he forgets the last verse and replaces it with what can only be described as dramatic gargling. A stale crust of bread is lobbed in his direction. Whether it's applause or a plea for silence remains debatable. Soon after, a handful of guests start sagging under the combined weight of stew and exhaustion. One trader leans back so far on his stool, he's effectively part of the furniture now, serving as a footrest for his companion. Marjorie stacks empty mugs into a tower of implied warnings. She doesn't scold. She just arches one eyebrow, universal innkeeper sign for wrap it up or fetch a broom. Inevitably, it's always a latecomer who insists on ordering something long after the fire has gone dim. Tonight, it's a peddler demanding a light snack, which he defines as a roast duck. He is instead offered bread, a firm look, and instructions to chew slowly and sleep sooner. The goat, naturally, has curled up by the embers. It's not technically welcome inside, but since it pays more attention during story hour than most travelers, the rules are flexible. The innkeeper does his nightly sweep, prods at the dying fire, Makes sure nobody is face down in the stew pot. Carefully shifts a snore from tabletop to bench, a skill perfected by years of repositioning the unconscious. Upstairs, a couple stumbles their way to bed, colliding with every surface in sight. By morning, they'll complain about the noise. The irony is quietly treasured. Eventually, the crowd thins, not all at once, but in soft, uneven waves of cloaks, yawns, and hiccups. The chatter ebbs, laughter fades, and the inn drifts into quiet sort of. A mug rolls off a table. A boot hits the floor upstairs. The goat sighs loudly. Still, by inn standards, the night is winding down. Climbing the stairs is an exercise in faith, not religious, but structural. The steps creak and shift like they're considering early retirement. Yet for the weary, upstairs means one thing: collapse. Rooms vary. Wealthier guests might get privacy. The rest cram into shared dormitories where strangers lie shoulder to shoulder, and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw, hopes, and small regrets. Blankets exist if fortune smiles. Pillows only if you packed your own or folded your cloak inventively. The straw never rests quietly, sometimes from dryness, sometimes because something alive inside it also wants sleep. Snoring starts within minutes. Not charming, delicate snoring, medieval snoring, the kind that rattles beams and makes you suspect a boar has nested in the rafters. Privacy is non-existent. Pulling your cloak over your head only muffles the sound of your neighbor muttering about taxes and fish. Someone else gets up repeatedly to check the stew, which everyone knows means the chamber pot behind a laughable curtain. Speaking of which, yes, the chamber pot. Stare. It's full. It's everyone's burden. It's times also a footrest, until realization arrives too late. Inevitably, someone wanders in after dark, unsure of their bed, prepared to argue. These disputes are brief, muffled by exhaustion, and settled by whoever has larger boots or stronger odor. And yet, despite the noise, the smells, the creaking straw, there's an odd coziness to it. Dozens of strangers sleeping under the same crooked roof, snoring in ragged unison. It's not peaceful, but it's safe, warmish, and if fortune favors, goat-free. By inn standards, that's luxury. Downstairs, the fire has dwindled to embers. The building murmurs with the occasional groan of beams or something alive navigating them. Time for the innkeeper's midnight round. It's an unwritten ritual involving a candle stub, an exhausted sigh, and a prayer that no one has died, ignited anything, or wandered into the pantry again. He checks benches, empty enough, cups, half finished, half spilled, half fermenting into something new. A spoon floats in the ale barrel, best not to ask. Doors are bolted. Probably the front one tends to swing open during storms or heated debates, so he props a bucket against it, just in case. Coins are counted, though half of them are buttons, bones, or the same worthless pair of shoes that keeps returning to circulation. Upstairs, he creeps carefully, each board squealing louder than the last. Behind one door, heroic snoring. Behind another, muttering about taxes. In the shared room, cloaks and limbs tangle across creaky frames. One guest has decided to sleep upside down. Another hides under a bed like forgotten luggage. The chamber pot, inevitably, is full. Then come the oddities. A broom fallen again, a candle flickering in a draftless hall. The faint twang of a lute string, even though the bard was supposedly tied to the wagon outside, and of course, the goat is missing. The innkeeper exhales. By this in standards, everything is fine. He descends, blows out the candle, and mutters, "If anything burns, let it be the stew." Night settles. The upstairs chamber buzzes like a hive of human discomfort. Snoring layers itself into a dreadful harmony. One guest hiccups with every breath. Another rattles the rafters. Another mumbles endlessly about carrots. Someone whispers, "No, my lord," with unnerving intimacy. A boot thuds to the floor. Nobody stirs. The goat is curled smugly beneath a borrowed cloak. The beds complain at every toss and turn, straw stabbing indiscriminately. If it doesn't jab within 5 minutes, the mattress is probably haunted. Heat builds from too many bodies. Cloaks are tossed aside. A shutter opened, allowing in both breeze and owl, who refuses to leave. The smell grows rich. A heady blend of stew, digestion, damp wool, unwashed feet, goat warmth, and lingering ale. Unbearable, if not for universal exhaustion. Occasionally, someone wakes certain it's dawn. It isn't. It's just darker. And now there's an owl watching, shushed back into place with a grunt. Marjorie dozes in her back room, tuned to every suspicious crash or hint of forbidden music. The innkeeper snores behind the bar, mug in hand, dreaming of silence he'll never have. Because in a medieval inn, sleep doesn't come easy. It arrives in short bursts, in crowded rooms, in suspicious warmth. But everyone is horizontal. And that, here, counts as victory. At the very first hint of daylight, that murky gray that might be dawn, or might just be an ambitious moon then, begins to rouse. Not gracefully, more like a pen of livestock, realizing the gate was left ajar. Feet hit the floorboards with varying enthusiasm. Someone groans like waking up was an insult. Another guest immediately begins hunting for a missing boot. It's by the hearth. How it got there is a mystery known only to the goat, who refuses to share. The dormitory empties in waves. Early birds, merchants, monks, and the guilty creep out first, leaving behind tangled blankets, muddy smears, and one lone dreamer muttering that he never touched the cheese. Downstairs, the innkeeper is awake. His eyes are open, his posture upright, but his soul still lingers somewhere, pleasant, probably a dream tavern with polished mugs and respectful patrons. Marjorie arrives soon after, draped in a shawl and sheer willpower. She silently surveys the overnight wreckage. 2 toppled stools, 1 vanished candle, and mysteriously jam on the broom handle. Questions fly at her immediately. Has anyone seen my satchel? Did I pay last night? Is this goat mine? Each gets the same reply, a long blink and a flat maybe. Then come the denials. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't snoring. I never insulted the monk's sandals. All shouted while the evidence hangs plain a ladle tucked into someone's belt, or half a turnip peeking out of a boot. The bard staggers back, wild-eyed, insisting he's composed a new verse about last night's adventures. He's silenced with a bowl of porridge. To everyone's surprise, he actually eats in quiet. Breakfast begins. Reheated stew, a splash of ale, business as usual. By full sunrise, most guests have settled their debts, some honestly, some by barter, and a few by vanishing quickly. Some depart sheepishly, others strut off, convinced they were delightful company. But none ever admit to what truly happened after supper. The goat is shooed outside again. Marjorie scrapes something unidentifiable off a bench with surgical precision, and the common room exhales. It isn't peaceful, exactly, just pausing. The hearth spits its last embers. The floor clings to boots. A bench leans suspiciously left, perhaps from overuse or rebellion. The innkeeper clutches his morning ale like its family treasure, surveying the battlefield. Not too bad, he mutters an optimistic lie he repeats every dawn because optimism aids digestion. Marjorie passes with a tray of battered spoons, rag in hand, and the expression of someone who won't be answering questions before sunrise tomorrow. She tops the pot with water, salt, and hope, stirring breakfast into existence. Outside, life stirs. A cart rattles past. A rooster crows its authority. Somewhere, a smith hammers far too loudly for this hour. The world is awake again, and with it, fresh customers. The inn's door swings open. Farmer drags in a sack that might contain vegetables, or not. Behind him, a woman in a travel cloak smiles politely. the kind of smile sharpened for complaints about prices. And, inevitably, a knight clatters in dented helmet, booming voice, and no sense of indoor volume. Nods are exchanged, coins clink, vague answers are given. The cycle restarts. The innkeeper sips. Marjorie reties her apron. A chair is set upright, a mug filled, and a stranger immediately asks if there's a vegan option. The inn doesn't change. Quote, the stew remains mysterious. The guests, unpredictable. The goat, suspiciously well acquainted with the door latch. Yet, despite the racket, the chaos, and the strange aromas, travelers always return. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, or the comfortable disorder. Or maybe it's because here, your worst mistakes get swept up with the crumbs. And no one dares ask questions before breakfast. Switching gears. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a flapjack, and just as flat. But appearances deceived. This soggy patch of reclaimed marsh was about to swing far beyond its weight, while the rest of Europe bickered over crowns, creeds, and shiny boots. The Dutch quietly stitched together an empire of light, trade, and oil paint. It began with rebellion. Spain had lorded over the Netherlands for decades, brandishing Catholic authority and squeezing taxes from every herring in tulip bulb. After nearly 80 years of revolt, the Dutch finally declared, "We're finished." In 1648, freedom was official. What followed wasn't tidy governance so much as entrepreneurial chaos. Think Silicon Valley of everyone wore wooden clogs and speculated in salted fish. Amsterdam became Europe's Wall Street, its ports jammed with ships sailing to Asia, Africa, and the Americas anywhere, with goods to acquire or people to exploit. The Dutch East India Company, the Amazon prime of its age, grew rich off nutmeg, porcelain, and, of course, colonization. Meanwhile, back home, ordinary people were reading newspapers, drinking beer, and commissioning portraits from Rembrandt and Vermeer. These painters didn't just depict faces, they created legends. Vermeer lit quiet domestic scenes like sacred cinema. Rembrandt injected biblical elders with more drama than a reality show. And art was no longer just for kings, merchants, and butchers wanted their likenesses, too. Even a pork seller could afford a still life with a pig's head and a lemon. And then came tulip mania, a brief but absurd frenzy where people mortgaged entire houses for a single bulb. The market collapsed like a drunk sailor on cobblestones. But by then, the Dutch were already infamous, prosperous, unpredictable, and never dull. So how did the tiny, damp republic become Europe's envy, a mastering oceans, speculation, and self-portraits? The heart of the Golden Age wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It pulsed in the docks Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delft, not mere towns, but launch pads for global dominance, powered by sails, ledgers, and a lot of herring. Why? Because this was a middle-class country. Merchants, bakers, and brewers had money and taste. Tage. They didn't want cherubs floating in clouds. Tage. They wanted something that looked like their world, but slightly better lit. And the painters delivered. Dutch art became an industry, vast, detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Veer. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout, they whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about intimacy, solitude, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. In the next chapter, we'll step out of these golden lit rooms and into the streets of a booming republic. Because outside Vermeer's windows, an economic experiment was brewing that would both dazzle and implode. The infamous tulip mania. Picture this. If you walk into a pub in 1636, you're just a regular Dutch citizen, maybe a baker or a cheese merchant. A man next to you offers to sell you a tulip bulb, not a bouquet, just one bulb. The price, the same as your house. And the crazy part? You consider it. Welcome to tulip mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, and possibly the world's first recorded financial bubble. The Dutch didn't invent flowers, of course, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare striped varieties caused by a virus that oddly made them more desirable, became status symbols. Owning a unique tulip bulb was like driving a Ferrari today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally made soup out of it. At first, it was just wealthy collectors dabbling. But soon, everyone wanted in. Farmers, barbers, chimney sweeps. If you could hold a coin and had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire savings were spent. Futures contracts were created. People traded rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed yet. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed. For a brief, dazzling moment, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then came the crash. One February day in 1637, people stopped buying. Maybe they blinked and realized they were mortgaging homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a tulip and thought, wait, that's it? Prices collapsed. Fortunes vanished. And suddenly, that one bulb you paid the price of a canal house for, worthless. Might as well plant it and try to enjoy the view. Strangely enough, the Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was embarrassing. Yes, there were lawsuits, there were public sermons about greed and vanity, but the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. It wasn't their last brush with speculative mania, just the prettiest one. Tulip mania became a moral tale about hubris, irrational markets, and the human tendency to chase beauty until it bites. But while the bulbs rotted, the Dutch spirit didn't, because just around the corner, the Republic was building a cultural empire on books, maps, and ideas, and that's where we head next. While tulips were being traded like gold, and Vermeer was busy painting women doing very quiet things near windows, something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic. The mind. The Dutch didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas. And in the 17th century, that was dangerous business. Let's start with printing presses. At a time when publishing the wrong opinion in, say, Spain could get unaidly burned at the stake, the Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't mess with trade, which meant books flowed out of Amsterdam like wine at a merchant banquet. Ideas banned elsewhere found safe harbor here. Descartes wrote and published in the Netherlands. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher who suggested that maybe God wasn't an old man in the sky, but something more like reality itself, lived and thought here in relative peace until he became too radical, even for the radicals. Universities like Leiden and Utrecht became intellectual magnets. Students from across Europe came to study everything from law and medicine to the latest theories in optics and anatomy. And because this was the Dutch, they studied in buildings clean enough to eat off and cataloged their knowledge with terrifying precision. Crafty also thrived. Dutch mapmakers like Joan Blio were not just sketching coastlines, they were redrawing the European imagination. Their atlases were masterpieces, decorative, wildly inaccurate in parts, but astonishingly detailed for their time. Want to explore the coast of Java or dream about Brazil? Let's open a Dutch map. This intellectual curiosity wasn't limited to scholars. The middle class read audaciously pamphlets, travelogues, scientific treatises, and scandalous poetry. Newspapers circulated stories from Constantinople to the New World. For the first time in European history, literacy wasn't a luxury, it was a lifestyle. But it wasn't all enlightenment and espresso. These ideas stirred the pot. Religious tensions simmered. Philosophers were censored. Some books were quietly banned. The Dutch tolerated a lot. But even tolerance has its limits when prophets start messing with property law. Still, For a republic of just a few million people, the Dutch punched far above their weight in shaping modern thought. And speaking of shaping, next, we turn to the architectural boom that transformed their cities into Baroque Lego sets of brick, canals, and proud gables. Imagine a city built like a painting. Straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place. Even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century. It's a masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities. They drained them into existence. Much of the land the Republic stood on was technically underwater or had been recently persuaded not to be. With dikes, pumps, and sheer willpower, the Dutch reshaped their world. Where other nations saw a swamp, they saw potential real estate. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring of Amsterdam, known as the Grafton Gordel. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close as urban planning gets to poetry. Concentric canals carved the city into districts. Goods moved by boat, not cart. Rich merchants built narrow houses with steep steps and grand windows, showing off just enough wealth to impress, but not enough to look French. Those tall houses with the ornate gables, they weren't just aesthetic choices. They were tax strategies. Property taxes were based on width, not height. So, people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance. A result, an architectural skyline that looks like gingerbread real estate and smells faintly of Calvinist restraint. Brick was the material of choice. It was cheap, durable, and made the streets look like a Renaissance Minecraft server. But design wasn't only about beauty. The Dutch emphasized utility. Even their ornate facades had winches and pulleys to lift furniture up through windows, since spiral staircases inside were less stately and more claustrophobia simulator. Public buildings also bloomed. Town halls, ways, guild halls, is the grandest of them all. Amsterdam's town hall, finished in 1655. It was so magnificent that Louis XIV reportedly called it the eighth wonder of the world and promptly copied it, as was his habit. And amid all this architectural splendor, there was a message. The Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about cities, citizens, and civic pride. Clean streets, tidy, facades, order, and elegance. This was a built environment that reflected a national mindset, precise, practical, and quietly proud. But beneath this order, tensions simmered. Political divisions, religious strife, and international rivals were gathering. In the next chapter, we dive into the conflicts, internal and external, that would test the very seams of this golden republic. For all its brilliance, the Dutch Golden Age wasn't some utopia of harmony and polite cheese tasting. Behind the tulips and oil paintings lay a republic built on tension, political, religious, and increasingly military. First, the politics. The Dutch Republic wasn't really a republic in the modern sense. It was a jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its rights like a toddler hoarding snacks. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class in cities like Amsterdam and Leiden. These men weren't nobles, but they had the money to pretend. At the top of the political pyramid was the stadtholder, usually from the House of Orange, a military leader with just enough power to make everyone nervous. Think of him as a monarch with a disclaimer. Some provinces liked him, others liked him less. The result, a constant tug-of-war between centralized leadership and provincial independence, a sort of political group project where half the group wants to fire the leader and the other half is the leader's cousin. Religiously, the Dutch had technically broken with Catholicism, but that didn't mean unity. The Calvinists were in charge, and they weren't exactly famous for their open-mindedness. The Protestants, Jews, and Catholics were tolerated as long as they didn't cause a fuss, build big churches, or throw parades. Publicly, everything was orderly. Privately, it was tense. Internationally, the Dutch was suddenly a major power, and the old guard didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant pals, now saw them as economic rivals. Cue the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of naval brawls where both sides lost ships, pride, and occasionally their tempers. The Dutch held their own thanks to admirals like Michel de Ruyter, who was equal parts pirate, strategist, and national hero. He once sailed up the Thames and stole the English flagship for fun. But warfare is expensive, maintaining fleets, defending trade routes, and bribing neighbors not to attack. All this added strain to a delicate system, okay? And while the Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show, not in the art or the architecture, but in the very system that built it. Next, we'll visit the twilight of this era and ask, how does the Golden Age end? With a crash, a war, or simply a yawn from history? Golden Ages don't typically end with explosions. More often, they fade quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left and someone just knocked over the wine. The Dutch Republic in the late 1600s wasn't collapsing, it was sighing. The signs were subtle at first. Trade remained strong, but competitors were catching up. The English and French were getting better at naval warfare and even better at copying Dutch business models. The English created their own East India Company, threw in some colonial ambition, and added the one thing the Dutch didn't have: a monarchy with a flair for self-promotion. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive, very aggressive. He wasn't content with verses and fancy shoes. He wanted borders, power, and maybe a few Dutch cities while he was at it. The resulting wars were brutal and expensive. Taj won a few, lost a few more, and bled money throughout. Domestically, the Republic had another problem: boredom. Innovation slowed. Okay. Painters stopped painting radical new ideas and started repeating what sold: rows of cows, ships, and sleepy windmills. Art became safe. Banking became cautious. The canal houses were still pretty, but the energy had shifted. You could feel the flicker in the oil lamp. There were deeper fractures, too. The divide between the House of Orange and the Republican regents deepened. The middle class, once the engine of prosperity, began to stagnate. Tensions brewed between old money and new ambition. And most importantly, young Dutch people stopped believing they were at the center of the world, because they weren't anymore. Its final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in wind. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's financial and naval superpower. France stole the stage in art and science until the guillotine got involved. And the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged out of the spotlight. Okay. But the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age never disappeared. It lived on in libraries, in galleries, in legal codes, and shipping routes. The world they helped shape didn't forget them. They just stopped being the main character. Next, in our final chapter, we explore the lasting impact of this remarkable era and how a tiny republic changed the course of the modern world. Though the curtain fell on the Dutch Golden Age, its echoes have never truly stopped. The 17th century republic might have lost its global dominance, but it left fingerprints on everything from economics to art to how we imagine freedom itself. Let's start with capitalism. The Dutch didn't invent money, trade, or greed, but they streamlined them with breathtaking efficiency. They created the world's first stock exchange, pioneered shareholder capitalism, and made financial instruments that are still used today. If you've ever cursed your mutual fund or stared blankly at a line graph, you have Dutch merchants to thank. They also revolutionized global commerce, not just through ships, but through systems. Insurance, record-keeping, double-entry bookkeeping, all sharpened to near perfection in Amsterdam. Hey, and while they certainly weren't saints, hello, colonialism They were logistical geniuses. They made trades scalable, predictable, global. In the arts, their influence is immortal. Vermeer's quiet light, Rembrandt's stormy faces, the intimate realism of domestic scenes. These became the visual grammar of Western art. Their paintings taught us that greatness didn't require gods and swords. Sometimes it was a woman pouring milk, caught in a moment of stillness. In ideas, they carved out a space for reason. The Dutch tolerance, imperfect but notable, allowed thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes to publish works that would have been burned elsewhere. In doing so, they helped push Europe toward the Enlightenment. Freedom of thought, religious pluralism, scientific curiosity, all took root in the Dutch soil. Even their cities set a standard. Amsterdam's canals, Utrecht's universities, the brick gables and clean, navigable streets all served as templates for modern urban life. Order without opulence, function dressed in elegance. They didn't build for kings. No, they built for citizens. Okay? Perhaps that's the heart of it. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't about empires or cathedrals or divine right. It was about what a small, determined, soggy republic could achieve with brains, grit, and slightly obsessive bookkeeping. It didn't last forever. Golden Ages never do. But in the brief glow of that century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success. One powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks to them, the modern world sails in their wake, charting new waters on maps they helped draw. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very prestigious, the first recorded event. The stadium, a short foot race roughly 600 feet long, or one stayed. The only known victor that year was a cook named Coro Boss of Ellis. That's right. The first Olympic champion was a guy who probably trained by running between kitchens and slicing goat meat. He didn't get a trophy. He got an olive wreath, eternal glory, and the right to have poems written about his thighs. All competitors were Greek, male, and citizens. No women allowed to compete or even watch unless they were priestesses. Married women caught sneaking in, risked being hurled off a cliff, which feels a bit extreme, even by ancient standards. But despite the simplicity, the stakes were enormous. To win an Olympia wasn't just a personal triumph. It brought glory to your Palachi, your city-state. You were no longer just a man. You were a hero. And heroes in ancient Greece lived forever. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one guy sprinting 600 feet turned into a sprawling schedule of events that tested every aspect of the male body. Speed, strength, balance, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics. Running. After the stadium, more races were added. The DOs was essentially the ancient 400-meter dash. One length of the track there, one back. Then came the decos, a long D distances race that could last up to 24 laps. That's over 5 kilometers in the Greek summer sun, naked. Water breaks, no music playlists. It's just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. But it wasn't all about speed. It's okay. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that. Wrestling or pale was a technical affair. Okay, no biting or eye gouging, but pretty much everything else was fair. Game. You had to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pancration. A mix of boxing and wrestling, where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokes. It was violent, raw, and beloved. The rules. Try not to kill your opponent, at least not in front of the judges. Boxing, called pygmakia, was brutal. No gloves, just leather straps wrapped around the knuckles. Just often ended in blood and broken bones, and surrender was the only way out. It was less float like a butterfly and more survive with your teeth. Then there was the pentathlon, a 5-inch spectacle for the ultimate all-rounder. It included running, wrestling, long jump, javelin, and discus. The long jump was done with weights called halter, supposedly to add momentum, which sounds more like a tripping hazard than an athletic boost. And finally, chariot racing. Held in the hippodromium, it was fast, dangerous, and occasionally fatal. The interesting twist, the owners of the horses won the prize, not the drivers. So, some aristocrat could pay a stable boy to risk his life for glory and still take home the olive wreath. Classic. Each event pushed men to their limits and sometimes past them. But they weren't competing for gold or money, okay? They were chasing something even more valuable in ancient Greece, Cleo's eternal fame. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening biceps in front of the crowd. They were, first and foremost, an act of worship. The athletes weren't simply competitors, they were pilgrims. And Olympia, that wasn't just an arena, was a sacred site dedicated to the king of the gods himself, Zeus. Nestled in a lush grove called the Altus, Olympia was more temple than stadium, for a single race was run, or a discus was hurled. The sacred atmosphere had to be honored. It's the most important structure, the Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed a gigantic ivory and gold statue of the god sculpted by Phidias. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And yes, it absolutely loomed over the games like a divine referee. The rituals began days before the competitions. Athletes took oaths before a statue of Zeus Hawaios, Zeus of the Oaths, swearing not to cheat, bribe, or bite during wrestling. Breaking that vow wasn't just poor sportsmanship, it was sacrilege. Cheaters were fined and their penalties paid for bronze statues of Zeus that lined the entrance path, eternal reminders of their shame. And then there were the sacrifices. Lots of them. Dozens of bulls were slaughtered at the altar of Zeus. The smoke, the chanting, the blood. It was all part of a massive communal offering. The meat was cooked and shared among spectators and priests, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was central to the ceremony. A sacred flame believed to have been lit by the rays of the sun burned at the altar of Hestia. This tradition inspired the modern Olympic flame, though thankfully without the animal sacrifice. Spectators, athletes, judges, they didn't just come for sport. They came for religious renewal, for a chance to witness divine favor manifest through human excellence. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you didn't pray hard enough. And at night, with the contests done and the altars still warm, Olympia glowed with music, feasting, and philosophy. It was worship, festival, and spectacle, all in one. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, we hope you were Greek male and very, very nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules strict, the requirements intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be free-born Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners, not even women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states across the Greek world, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond, but only if they could prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was more than paperwork. It was a birthright, and without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was standard. Why? For one, the Greeks believed the human body, particularly the male body, was the physical expression of divine perfection. Also, it made cheating harder. No secret weapons, no armor, and no hiding behind flashy gear. Just you, your muscles, and maybe a very unfortunate sunburn. Training wasn't optional. Athletes had to prove they'd been preparing for 10 months prior and undergo a final month of supervised training at Olympia itself. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a brutal regimen of running, grappling, and tossing heavy things until you resembled a marble statue, minus the helpful plinth. Now, about women. They were banned from competing, and in most cases, from even watching. A married woman caught attending could be thrown off Mount Tapian. Exceptions were made only for unmarried women, particularly priestesses like the priestess of Dedita, who had front row seats as part of her religious office. But don't worry, women had their own games. The Herring Games, honoring the goddess Hera with foot races for girls and young women, fully clothed. Of course, age categories existed: boys, youths, and men. But you still had to be ready to take a punch from someone twice your size. And there were no weight classes. Wrestling a guy the size of a temple column. Tough luck, kid. Zeus decides the outcome. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were of athletic prowess. It's proud, patriarchal, and meticulously regulated. To the casual observer, the ancient Olympic Games might seem like a wholesome celebration of athleticism and divine devotion. But beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches was something far more strategic: politics. Because in ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the Palachi, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international PR. Athens might build temples, but Sparta might train soldiers, but Olympia, that's where they showcased national identity. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, it glorified the polis he came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown superiority. City-states, even, funded and trained athletes as a matter of prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging in from the olive grove. They were finely tuned instruments of civic propaganda. Victories were immortalized in poems, statues, and elaborate public ceremonies. Entire cities would give free meals for life to Olympic victors, because nothing says you represent our greatness like unlimited wine and lamb chops. The Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles. They were for flexing alliances. Political leaders used the games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed. Marriages were negotiated. Even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce that accompanied the games. Oh yes, the Olympic truce, or Icharia. This was a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities during the games so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, others simply ignored the memo. Sparta, naturally, was banned from the games at least once for being too war-happy. Monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained wealth often built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or falsifying citizenship, their city's reputation suffered. In the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece wasn't a matter of signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment, equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising amount of sand in your undercarriage. You didn't just show up at Olympia ready to run. You had to prove it. And before you even got close to the track, you were expected to survive months of punishing preparation. Athletes trained at the gymnasium, a Greek institution that was part fitness center, part temple, and part philosophy class. The word gymnasium literally means place to be naked, which tells you most of what you need to know. Training was conducted in the nude, not for shock value, but because the Greeks believed in celebrating the human form as a vessel of divine strength. Each city had its own gymnasia, but serious Olympic hopefuls traveled to Elis, the city that administered the games. Here, under the watchful eyes of officials and trainers, they endured a mandatory 30-day trial before the Olympics. No distractions, no wine, no excuses. Just relentless exercise and a diet that would make modern athletes weep. Barley bread, figs, cheese, and lots of olive oil rubbed on the body, not eaten. The trainers, called PA tribes, weren't gentle. They pushed their athletes through wrestling drills, sprinting routines, javelin throws, and strength exercises. The Greeks had no patience. 4 slackers. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. And they meant it. Judges actually disqualified contestants before the games even started if they didn't meet the physical standard. Discipline was everything. No gym memberships, no protein shakes, no fans cheering you on from Instagram, just the grind. Ancient athletes endured punishing heat, strict diets, and grueling repetition, all for a fleeting moment of glory. And maybe a lifetime of free meals if they won. And it wasn't just about the body. The ideal athlete was expected to have a sound mind, too. Gymnasia were also places of learning where future champions discussed philosophy, ethics, and the meaning of erite, excellence in all things. To compete in Olympia was to pursue perfection, not just victory, not just strength, but to become something closer to the gods. The sun rises over Olympia. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and anticipation. For 5 days, the sacred sanctuary becomes the epicenter of the Greek world. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpockets all converge for the spectacle. Today is not a normal day. Today, the gods are watching. The opening procession is a blend of ceremony and flexing. Athletes stripped bare and shining with olive oil march in a line. Spectators cheer, city-states wave banners, and judges called the Hellenadai look on with expressions that say, "We'll disqualify you for blinking funny." The crowd is massive. Tens of thousands cram into the stadium, sitting on stone or dirt embankments, shaded only by the occasional olive tree and a well-placed sun hat. There are no tickets, no assigned seats, and no bathrooms worth mentioning. What there is, however, is noise, lots of it. Shouts of support, jeers at rivals, vendors hawking wine and honey, cakes, and philosophers grumbling about the decline of morals. Then the trumpet blasts. The events begin. Runners launch from their marks with no starting pistol, just a loud shout and the tension of 1,000 eyes. Wrestlers grapple in the sand, slipping in the oil and kicking up dust. Chariots race dangerously around hairpin turns in the hippodromium, where crashes are frequent and occasionally fatal. In the pancration, that's where things get downright primal. It's choking, twisting, punching, all in front of Zeus. Winners are crowned immediately after their events with an olive wreath from the sacred tree of Olympia. No medals, no podiums, just a loop of branches and the roar of the crowd, but the glory eternal. Victors are celebrated like war heroes back home. Their names are etched in stone, their likeness carved in marble. Hey? And if they're lucky, a poet like Pindar will immortalize their deeds in verse, long, dramatic, and extremely flattering verse. And through it all, the divine presence lingers. Offerings are made, bulls are sacrificed, the gods are thanked, because every leap, throw, and sprint isn't just for fame. It's an offering, a prayer made with muscle and grit. The games are over, the dust settles. Crowds pack up their amori and head home, but for a select few, those crowned with an olive wreath, life is never the same again. In ancient Greece, Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement. It was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning an Olympia meant you didn't just beat other men, you had pleased the gods. And that kind of divine favor came with serious perks. Victors returned to their pile as heroes. Statues were raised in their honor. Poets sang their praises in verses so flowery they could outshine the gardens of Aphrodite. Some cities gave their champions front row seats at public events. Others offered free meals for life, a far better prize than a medal, especially in a world where dinner wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy patrons lined up to sponsor you. Families arranged better marriage prospects. Children were taught your name in school, okay? And if you were from a small town, you might find your face carved on local coinage, your apps immortalized in bronze. The Dutch tolerance, imperfect but notable, allowed thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes to publish works that would have been burned elsewhere. In doing so, they helped push Europe toward the Enlightenment. Freedom of thought, the Dutch Golden Age, wasn't about empires or cathedrals or divine right. It was about what a small, determined, soggy republic could achieve with brains, grit, and slightly obsessive bookkeeping. It didn't last forever. Golden Ages never do. But in the brief glow of that century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success. One powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks to them, the modern world sails in their wake, charting new waters on maps they helped draw. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very negotiated. Even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce that accompanied the games. Oh yes, the Olympic truce, or Icharia. This was a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities during the games so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, others simply ignored the memo. Sparta, naturally, was banned from the games at least once for being too war-happy. Monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained wealth often built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or falsifying citizenship, their city's reputation suffered. In the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece wasn't a matter of signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment, equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising 4 slackers. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. And they meant it. Judges actually disqualified contestants before the games even started if they didn't meet the physical standard. Discipline was everything. No gym memberships, no protein shakes, no fans cheering you on from Instagram, just the grind. Ancient athletes endured punishing heat, strict diets, and grueling repetition, all for a fleeting moment of glory. And maybe a lifetime of free meals if they won. And it wasn't just about the body. The ideal athlete was expected to have a sound mind, too. Gymnasia were also places of learning where future champions discussed philosophy, ethics, and the meaning of erite excellence in all things. To compete in Olympia was to pursue perfection, not just victory, not just strength, but to become something closer to the gods. The sun rises over Olympia. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and anticipation. For 5 days, the sacred sanctuary becomes the epicenter of the Greek world. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpockets all converge for the spectacle. Today is not a normal day. Today, the gods are watching. The opening procession is a blend of what there is, however, is noise. Lots of it. Shouts of support, jeers at rivals, vendors hawking wine and honey cakes, and philosophers grumbling about the decline of morals. Then, the trumpet blower. The events begin. Runners launch from their marks with no starting pistol, just a loud shout and the tension of 1,000 eyes. Wrestlers grapple in the sand, slipping in the oil and kicking up dust. Chariots raced dangerously around hairpin turns in the Hippodromium, where crashes are frequent and occasionally fatal. In the Pancration, that's where things get downright primal. It's choking, twisting, punching, all in front of Zeus. Winners are crowned immediately after their events with an olive wreath from the sacred tree of Olympia. No medals, no podiums, just a loop of branches and the roar of the crowd, but the glory eternal. Victors are celebrated like war heroes back home. Their names are etched in stone, their likeness carved in marble, and, if they're lucky, a poet like Pindar will immortalize their deeds in verse, long, dramatic, and extremely flattering verse. And through it all, the divine presence lingers. Offerings are made, bulls are sacrificed, the gods are thanked, 'cause every leap, throw, and sprint isn't just for fame. It's an offering, a prayer made with muscle and grit. The games are over. The dust settles. Crowds pack up their armory and head home. But for a select few, those crowned with an olive wreath, life is never the same again. In ancient Greece, Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement. It was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning an Olympia meant you didn't just beat other men, you had pleased the gods. And that kind of divine favor came with serious perks. Victors returned to their pole as heroes. Statues were raised in their honor. Poets sang their praises in verses so flowery they could outshine the gardens of Aphrodite. Some cities gave their champions front row seats at public events. Others offered free meals for life, a far better prize than a medal, especially in a world where dinner wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy patrons lined up to sponsor you, as families arranged better marriage prospects. Children were taught your name in school. If you were from a small town, you might find your face carved on local coinage, your abs immortalized in bronze. But with fame came expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to vanish into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of a city's greatness. Some were sent on diplomatic missions, others recruited as generals. Their bodies had earned glory, and now their names had to carry it. Of course, not everyone handled the spotlight well. Some athletes grew arrogant. One famously tried to dedicate a statue to himself and the gods, only for the people to quietly change the inscription. Others tried to cheat in later games, thinking their reputation would protect them. Spoiler, it didn't. Those caught bribing opponents or lying about their citizenship were fined, humiliated, and sometimes had their names wiped from records. But for the honest few, the reward was Klaus' immortal fame. In Greek culture, Klaus was the golden ticket. The chance to be remembered not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. If you died young, your name lived on. If you lived long, you became a mentor, a legend, maybe even a myth. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame. Held every 4 years without fail, even through wars and plagues. From 776 B.C.I. Ward. Generation after generation of Greeks gathered at Olympia to honor the gods, chase glory, and maybe throw a javelin farther than anyone else. But even sacred traditions aren't immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had swallowed the Greek world. The games continued under Roman rule, but the original religious meaning began to fade. Romans enjoyed the spectacle, gladiators, chariots, public blood sports. But the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't translate as well when your emperor thought he was a god. Then came a final blow. In 393 CE, Emperor Theodosius Theudent, recently converted to Christianity, banned all pagan festivals. That included the Olympics. After more than a millennium, the torch was snuffed out. The temples of Olympia were left to crumble. Earthquakes and floods buried what was once the heart of the Greek world. The sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived only in legend. Their stories passed down through ancient texts, admired by scholars, but viewed as a relic of a vanished world, until in the 19th century, that old flame flickered back to life, inspired by the spirit of ancient Greece and a newfound obsession with classical antiquity. A Frenchman named Baron Pierre Dubetta decided it was time to bring the games back. Not in a ruined temple under olive trees, but as a modern international competition. And so, in 1896, the modern Olympic Games were born in Athens, fittingly, in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, the ideals of excellence, honor, and unity, in the pursuit of something greater than victory, immortality through achievement. From nude runners in dusty fields to televised gymnastics and synchronized swimming, the Olympic journey has never been linear, but it's always been human, messy, glorious, and ever-evolving. And it all began with a cook named Kroyos, a foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves beneath the gaze of Zeus. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive experiment. The revolution had been won, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling government, operating under the shiny new Constitution, was broke, and the question on everyone's mind was going to pay for. This, enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, who didn't just love strong financial systems, he worshipped them. Hamilton believed the key to national strength lay in federal authority and sound fiscal policy. His plan: consolidate state debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and here's the kicker: raise revenue through taxes. And not just any taxes, a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was widely produced, widely consumed, and, let's be honest, drank like water in many parts of the country, especially on the frontier, where clean water wasn't always guaranteed. Taxing whiskey was like taxing sunshine. You could count on it. But out on the western frontier, particularly in western Pennsylvania, farmers had other ideas. Many small-scale farmers didn't just drink whiskey. They made it. They turned excess grain into liquor because it was easier to transport, preserved well, and could be used like currency. Whiskey was liquid gold, literally. And now the federal government was reaching deep into their pockets to take a cut. Worse yet, the tax disproportionately hit small distillers, the very people scraping by with homegrown copper stills and a handful of corn. Large producers could pay a flat fee. Small farmers, they had to pay per gallon, and that felt like punishment by the bottle. To these men, this wasn't just a tax. It was a betrayal. A revolution had been fought over taxation without representation. And here was a distant government in Philadelphia telling them how to run their stills. Some called it tyranny. Others called it familiar. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to defiance, and all over whiskey. To understand why Western farmers exploded over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset. Life west of the Alleghenies wasn't just hard, it was practically medieval. Roads were muddy trails, news took weeks to travel, and government was a rumor from a far-off land called Philadelphia. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Whiskey wasn't merely a drink, it was a currency, a commodity, and a cultural cornerstone. A gallon of corn whiskey could buy nails, pay wages, or trade for a pig. Taxing it felt like taxing breath itself. And the federal excise tax, it hit small producers hardest, those who couldn't afford the lump sum, flat fee large distillers paid. Instead, they were taxed by the gallon, down to the last drop. So, farmers resisted, not with paperwork, but with pitchforks and muskets. At first, it was low-key civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored. Forms were left unfiled. But then came the intimidation. Officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of tar barrels and angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, resistance turned especially fierce. Collectors were harassed, threatened, or outright attacked. One was stripped, whipped, and left in the woods with feathers in his hair. A frontier fashion statement with a clear message. Go home. The federal courts issued subpoenas. No one showed. Marshals tried to deliver them. Locals ran them off. By 1793, it wasn't a protest anymore. It was open noncompliance, spreading across counties like spilled mash. What made it worse? Most of these people had fought in the Revolution. They had shed blood for independence. And now they were being taxed by a federal government that felt eerily similar to the monarchy they'd overthrown. Didn't we just do this? Was the unspoken and sometimes shouted sentiment. To them, Hamilton's tax was proof that the government didn't represent them. They saw Eastern elites lining their pockets while the frontier paid the price. The whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, scaring. It was a symbol of everything they feared about centralized power. And, all the while, the government watched with increasing concern. What began as lawbreaking was starting to look a lot like rebellion. By 1794, what began as scattered defiance had evolved into something far more serious, organized, armed, and determined. Western Pennsylvania was no longer just resisting the whiskey tax. It was actively challenging the federal government's right to govern at all. The flashpoint came in July 1794 when the U.S. Marshal named David Lennox and a tax inspector named John Neville, a wealthy former general and one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to try collecting the tax, found themselves in the rebels' crosshairs. Neville had fortified his house, Bower Hill, outside Pittsburgh, preparing for trouble. Trouble, as it turned out, came in the form of several hundred armed men. The standoff began when the rebels demanded the surrender of Neville and any incriminating tax documents. He refused. Shots were fired. By the next day, a full-blown gun battle erupted. Government troops, tax resistors, and locals exchanged musket fire. The Mills house was eventually set ablaze, and 2 people were killed. The message was clear. The frontier wasn't bluffing. In the days that followed, resistance turned into mobilization. Rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men formed around Pittsburgh, calling themselves Defenders of Liberty and channeling the rhetoric of 1776. They began organizing meetings, passing resolutions, and talking about independence. Not from Britain this time, but from the eastern United States. Federal officials fled. Tax offices shut down. Pittsburgh, terrified of being burned to the ground, tried to distance itself from the rebellion. Meanwhile, word of the uprising spread quickly, sparking copycat resistance in parts of Kentucky, Virginia, and even the Carolinas. Too many Americans, especially those in government, it was beginning to look like HSA's Rebellion 2.0, but with more guns and better whiskey. What the rebels wanted wasn't entirely clear. Some called for tax repeal, others for Western independence, and a few even suggested forming a new America west of the mountains. One thing was certain. This was no longer just a tax protest. It was a challenge to the authority of the federal government under the Constitution. The rebellion raised a terrifying question. If a single region could defy a federal law with impunity, what kind of union had they really built? By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had gone from a regional disturbance to a direct threat to the authority of the Constitution itself. In the East, elites feared the collapse of federal power. In the West, rebels were talking like revolutionaries. And in the middle stood President George Washington, watching his carefully stitched republic begin to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Washington understood what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if it went unpunished, it would send a clear message. The federal government could be ignored, defied, and embarrassed. So, he made a decision that stunned the young nation. He would lead the army himself. Washington became and remains the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had once stepped down from power after the Revolution, this wasn't ego, it was necessity. He wanted to show that the Constitution wasn't just parchment, had muscle. With Hamilton by his side and acting as his ever-enthusiastic second-in-command, Washington mobilized a massive force of nearly 13,000 troops, larger than the entire Continental Army at its peak. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia assembled like it was 1776 all over again, except this time they weren't fighting the British. They were heading west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in full military uniform, grim and deliberate. His presence was meant to intimidate, and it did. As the army marched westward, the rebels began to scatter. Many had assumed the government would stay in Philadelphia and argue over letters. They hadn't expected muskets, drums, and a president on horseback. By the time the federal army reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had dissolved. Leaders vanished. Local support evaporated. The show of force had worked, but Washington didn't want blood. Once the region was secured, he handed command over to General Harry Lee, and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made. The government could and would defend its laws. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. They found silence. The rebel militias had mostly vanished into the hills, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-X sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion hadn't ended in bloodshed. It had ended in a retreat. But justice still had to be served, at least symbolically. Over 150 suspected rebels were arrested, many of them more confused than combative. Some were rounded up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The federal government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant cracking down on poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason. Both had participated in the attack on Neville's estate at Bower Hill and were found guilty under the newly minted U.S. laws. And then, in a twist that perfectly captured the political complexity of the moment, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington knew something most revolutionaries turned presidents must eventually learn. Sometimes unity matters more than punishment. He had made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels might have turned them into martyrs, or worse, reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was calculated, yes, but also characteristic of his leadership style, firm in principle, restrained in action. His goal wasn't vengeance, it was precedent, and that precedent was crystal clear. The federal government had the right to tax and the power to enforce. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, the central authority had faced a challenge and passed the test, barely, but not everyone saw it that way. For some in the frontier regions, the rebellion confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government cared more about eastern elites than western farmers, that Hamilton's financial schemes served bankers, not barrel makers, that maybe, just maybe, the revolution had been for nothing. Still, the rebellion faded. The tax remained, at least for a while, but its legacy would ripple through American politics for decades. The muskets were quiet. The rebels had dispersed, but politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority, it exposed deep fractures in the new republic's identity, okay? And at the center of this divide were two towering figures with wildly different visions for America: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion as proof that a strong central government was not only necessary but essential to national survival. His ideal America was industrial, urban, financially stable, and respected abroad. The show of force in Pennsylvania was to him a victory for order, a win for rule of law. But Jefferson, he saw something entirely different. Jefferson, then Secretary of State, was appalled, not by the rebellion, but by Washington and Hamilton's military response. To Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters, the government had looked more like an empire than a republic, spending 13,000 troops to confront angry farmers over a lick. A tax. That wasn't an enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared that Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers, merchants, and elites, the very types who had lounged in London parlors while colonists fought at Bunker Hill. Jefferson's America was rural, decentralized, and rooted in the virtues of the independent farmer. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and James Madison began organizing opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republicans, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the Constitution, and the common man. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as mob sympathizers who turned America into France during the Reign of Terror. The rebellion, in other words, helped crystallize what had only been simmering before. America's first political parties. Lines were drawn. Newspapers took sides. The whiskey tax debate became shorthand for a larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between elite control and populist resistance. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically. It became a story both sides would retell in very different ways. The Whiskey Rebellion may have fizzled on the battlefield, but in the political arena, it lit a fire that would smolder for generations. It wasn't just about whiskey or taxes anymore. It became a symbol, and like most symbols, it was wielded differently depending on who was doing the wielding. For Federalists, the rebellion was proof that the new Constitution worked. After the chaos of the Articles of Confederation, where rebellion had gone unanswered and the government could barely afford ink, this time was different. The law was challenged, and the law responded. The peaceful dispersal of the rebels, followed by orderly trials and presidential pardons, painted a picture of mature, responsible governance. It was power restrained, not abused. The Democratic Republicans, however, the whole affair wire of hypocrisy. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation. Now, a federal government dominated by Eastern elites had marched an army across the Appalachians to crush a protest by poor farmers. It felt less like unity and more like occupation. To them, the rebellion symbolized a government that had forgotten its roots. This ideological tug-of-war spilled into public discourse. Newspapers ran fiery editorials. Political clubs debated the meaning of liberty. Was the rebellion a dangerous echo of mob rule or a desperate cry for fairness from the margins of the republic? Even the word rebellion became contested. Occasionally, Federalists insisted it was a treasonous insurrection. Democratic Republicans called it civil disobedience. In time, the events of 1794 became less about what happened and more about what it meant. And looming over all of it was the Constitution itself. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first moment the federal government tested its new legal framework against real resistance and survived. It proved that the balance of federal and state power was not just theoretical. It could be enforced. But it also highlighted a reality the founders couldn't ignore. Not everyone experienced the Constitution the same way. For the elites in Philadelphia, it was protection. For the farmers of western Pennsylvania, it was intrusion. After the smoke cleared and Washington's army marched home, the frontier returned to its usual rhythm of hard labor, hard weather, and hard liquor. The rebellion was over, at least officially. But the echoes didn't fade quickly, and neither did the resentment. Though the federal government had made its point, enforcement of the whiskey tax remained a mess. Collectors were still afraid to show their faces in the western counties. Revenue was minimal. In some regions, the tax was still completely ignored. The law existed on paper, but not in practice, and that was the irony. After all the drama, the military show of force, and the high-minded speeches about national authority, the whiskey tax barely worked. Even Alexander Hamilton, the policy's architect, began to realize it wasn't worth the cost. It had created massive political backlash, helped birth an opposition party, and stirred up anti-federal sentiment that would haunt the Federalists for years. All for a tax that didn't even bring in much revenue. Not exactly a win. Meanwhile, public opinion was shifting. The frontier wasn't just some backwards outlier. It was growing fast. More settlers were heading west. The idea of a centralized government taxing frontier livelihoods began to seem less like governance and more like a grudge. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties, he brought with him a very different philosophy. Where Hamilton had sought to build federal strength, Jefferson wanted to minimize government intrusion, especially on small farmers. So one of his first acts as president, repealing the whiskey tax. By 1802, it was gone. Just like that. The controversial tax that had sparked a rebellion shaped early political identity and sent George Washington riding into battle. Disappeared quietly with a few strokes of a pen. No riots, no flames, just a quiet admission that sometimes power isn't worth the fight. The law had held. Yes, but the people had spoken to, and for all its symbolism. The whiskey tax ultimately proved how fragile federal authority could be when it ignored the lives of those on the margins. In our final chapter, we'll reflect on the long-term legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion and how it still echoes in today's debates over government power and protest. The muskets are long silent, the barrels empty, the tax repealed. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion still lingers, aged like the liquor that sparked it. At first glance, it may seem like a footnote in the vast story of the early republic. A regional dispute, a tax gone wrong, a brief flicker of armed protest. But look closer and you'll see a moment that encapsulates a profound national dilemma. Who holds power and how far will people go to resist it? The rebellion forced the country to answer uncomfortable questions. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Yes, but would doing so fracture the very unity it sought to preserve? Also, yes, it highlighted the delicate balance between law and liberty. It showed that a republic doesn't run on paper alone. It runs on perception, participation, and trust. Washington's decision to ride out with the army wasn't just a flex. It was an act of symbolism, a demonstration that the Constitution was more than ink and ideals. But Jefferson's later repeal of the tax showed the flip side of that coin. Federal power must also listen, not just lead. In that tension between enforcement and empathy lies the DNA of American politics. Over time, the Whiskey Rebellion became a case study in governance. Scholars cite it when discussing federal authority, the limits of protest, or the birth of American political parties in modern debates about taxation, rural disenfranchisement, and federal overreach. They echo this story with eerie familiarity. Even culturally, the rebellion remains potent. Quit is the only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It sparked political movements, shifted national dialogue, and challenged the boundaries of dissent in a young democracy. In many ways, the rebellion wasn't about whiskey at all. It was about who gets heard when the government makes decisions that affect everyday lives. Today, the story of the Whiskey Rebellion serves as both warning and reminder that even in a democracy, laws must earn their legitimacy and power must be wielded with care. The line between governance and provocation is razor thin, and sometimes it runs straight through a glass of corn mash. Spree may have aged the whiskey, but the rebellion, it still burns.